Just thought I'd make a quick video of me actually trying to repair, or actually trying to clean out, the Freehub on my Axis 1 specialised wheel set at the back. Now, I've already done a lot of the actual removal of this, so I'm just going to show you so up to the point I've actually got. So I've already removed the cassette, so I've got the HG removal tool, so that now comes off. The two outer chain rings also come off, and I can now remove the cassette. So all that I have already done up to now. As it is, you've got to say this. Now, actually, when I took this apart, I found that the ball bearings in the Freehub were really rusty. At least on the Freehub side. On the other side, they weren't too bad actually. Or on the cassette side, sorry. Might be able to see that from there. Some of those are still nice and shiny. Some are quite rusty looking. So I thought I'd actually try and get the whole thing off and apart, just to see if I could give it a thorough clean out, I think. Now, to remove the Freehub body off there, for this particular hub, which I think is a Joytech, we need an 11mm Allen wrench, which I will just undo now, but I'll have to pause this moment. Hold on a minute. Okay, sorry for the break. Needed both hands for that one. Back here now. Now this is a standard anti-clockwise standard thread, so it just unscrews anti-clockwise. And on the particular Freehub we got on this wheel, it's got a captive nut or captive bolt that goes through to the actual hub itself. As you can see in here, may not be able to see that well. I'll try and get another torch. You can see this sort of there's a nail sprocket or the nail sort of teeth in there, so it shows it there, which obviously the equivalent in the back end of the Freehub. Let's go into, or actually connect to. So just get this off here. Now, what I found was that just put that down in a moment, the balls that were in this bit on that one side, like I showed you, were really rusty. Again, if I try and get a bit more light in here, I might actually be able to see inside there. Okay, so I made an initial attempt at cleaning this out. Let's just get the wheel out of the way now. I made an attempt at cleaning it out. So it sort of cleaned out some of the old grease that was on there. I made a bit of an attempt at that. But obviously there's a lot more grease inside, and it was really quite rusty grease. I mean, there was a lot of moisture sat in here, a lot of water, a lot of red rusty grease in there. So I really wanted to actually get the whole thing apart now. I did in the end, before I took it apart, I tried to clean that with some isopropyl alcohol. You do have to be a bit careful with this one. There is, again, I've removed it, there's a little rubber dust seal at the back here, where there's some old ball bearings. Before you do any degreasing, you want to remove that, because basically rubber seals don't like solvents or things like that. But what I've done instead is I did in the end dump it in a small gem jar, basically with some just petrol in it, and left that there for about half an hour. And that's got a lot of the actual old grease out. But I still quite like to actually see what the state of the bearings are, because it's actually, there is a little bit of play in this still. Now, to actually get this apart, you've got to take the dust cap off. So I actually just go and get the actual thing. Now, this outer bit here is a dust cap. It's actually a metal thing. I mean, you can try prising on these, but you risk damaging that inner edge. You might be able to prise it from the other side to sort of push through. Actually, in the end, I found that I could remove it with an actual nail. I found that you can put the nail head underneath, which sort of is then pressing on further in on it. So put it on the edge and give it a bit of a tap round, and eventually this thing should just pop out. There we go. Okay, so that is the dust seal removed. And now you can sort of get a bit better access into the actual cone of the bearing. Now, as you can see in here, if I shine a light in, you can see there's the sort of cone in there, or the inner race in there. Obviously the axle has a cone. Actually, if I try and grab that a moment. So here on my own, trying to hold the camera and do all this. That's the axle I took out of this. I think it's fairly standard, but it's obviously, you know, these sort of covers at the end are a bit tailored to that particular Freehub. The cone we got on this end, if it focuses that well, it's a little bit worn. This was the Freehub end, so this was the end that the balls are really rusty on, and you can sort of like see, I think, if the light shines on it, there is a bit of marking on there, so I might actually get myself a new set of cones on this one. And the other end actually is pretty good. There was one place where there was a little bit of scoring. I might just be able to see it there. That's not too bad, I don't think. So back to this. It's how now we disassemble it. Now there is a couple of slots in the top of this. Now I've seen other videos on the internet where people have, it looks like they've taken a socket wrench and they've sort of milled down the top to give it two sort of lugs. I haven't got anything I can do that with. However, what I did have was a piece of roof strapping that you hold, so roof tie strapping that you tie to the brickwork, you tie to the roof trusses, and it just holds the roof basically on your house. And it's quite a thick piece of steel, and it just so happens it's just the right width, just spot on, and about the right thickness to neatly fit in there. It's also fairly soft, so it does bend a bit, but that was quite good, because then at least I wasn't going to be making any damage to the actual bearing seat. Now, that seat in there, you have to be a bit careful. It is opposite threaded, so you're actually going to have to undo that by tightening it, effectively undo it by turning clockwise rather than anti-clockwise, which is the usual way of doing this. So if you just bear with me, I'll just loosen it. I've loosened it off now, just about to take it apart. In fact, I've already taken it apart, but unfortunately that bit of the video actually died on my phone, so it didn't work properly. Now the easiest way I found to actually get this apart is because you're going to have to hold the centre bit quite tight, so it's actually easier if you screw it back into the wheel, and then you can loosen it off with that, loosen off against that. You could try holding it with a vice, but you risk damaging the splines on the other end, so that's probably not a good idea. Like I said before, remember this is you've got to undo this by actually turning it clockwise, and it is held in quite tightly, so it's going to take quite a bit of force to actually undo this. So if we now just sort of undo this now, one thing I have done with this, and one thing you need to be careful of, is if you have degreased it, or if you're taking this apart, this has got something like 25 or about 50 actually ball bearings in it. Now, because I've degreased this already, when I took it apart, when I lifted it apart, the ball bearings quite happily sort of came out, no problem at all, fell out and sort of ping around the workmate. It would be advisable, therefore, to do this on a large sheet of paper or in a recessed tray or something. If you haven't degreased it and there's a lot of gunk in there, a lot of old grease, the ball bearings are probably going to stay where they are. But even so, you still want to make sure that you don't have the things dropping onto the floor, because they are a real pain to find, trust me. So I'll say I've already taken this apart, so if we do that. So here are the three major parts. Here's the ball bearing seat. As you can see, there's the two notches that we need to get our tool into. Here is the the sort of freewheel mechanism with the 3 paws. Now, these are spring-loaded. On this particular one, there actually are 3 of them. I have seen videos where, although there are 3 positions, there's only actually 2 sort of spring-loaded paws in those positions. Not quite sure why. Now, remember, when you're taking these sort of things apart, things like the spacers here, make sure you know what order they came in. This particular one has actually got 3. There's a thick and slightly wider one that goes right next to the actual paws. There's a slightly smaller diameter one, but a bit thick, or not quite as thick as the first one, that goes next, and then there's a very thin one that goes right on top. So make sure you retain those. Like I say, if we come a bit close on this one, come a bit close to the light, there you can see the 3 paws. Now you can actually see there's actually have some rusting on them, which I'm going to clean off. They do sort of spring load still, and you can just about see there's a wire that goes around the centre there, sort of spring wire. Is actually providing the sort of spring loading, and around the bottom there is the outer sort of race seat that was on the other side. Which you have a look inside the main bit, the body itself. We get the light right. Oh yeah, there we go. You can just about see the teeth in there, and that's what the paws sort of grab onto. But if we pull that together, hold up the light, we may actually be able to see. Can you do that? There we go. You can see the teeth in there, the paws engaging onto the teeth at the side. Now, as I said, I took the ball bearings out already. Well, actually, some of them fell out. There's a little tub of them. Like I say, there are 50, 49. There's one still on my floor somewhere. They are quite worn, or certainly quite rusty. So I think actually I'm going to replace these anyway. So the fact I've dropped one on the floor kind of makes a difference. There are 25 on the sort of the inner race down there, and there were 25 a bit higher up on the underside of that race. So sort of 25 either side. Now, I did measure them with a pair of micrometers, or a pair of calipers actually, no, micrometer, and they were 3.15 millimeters, I think. The closest standard bearing size will be a 1/8 bearing, which is something like 3.175 millimeters. So, yeah, I think that's probably the correct size. I mean, like I say, these are distinctly rough now, obviously corroded. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to try and clean up some of the bit of rusting on the paws there, probably take the actual spring off. There was a bit of rusting on the side of this, but I've actually just polished it off with a little bit of wire wool. I wouldn't go for anything any more abrasive than wire wool. I mean, wire wool is semi-abrasive. I mean, this is, at least the seat is hardened, so you shouldn't make much of an impact, and it gets off any rust, like surface rust you've got on there. Like I say, I wouldn't go for anything else which is harder, or go for any of the sort of the blackened metal, because obviously you don't want to do that. In fact, you might be able to see in here, the light's right, maybe not, but there is a little bit of rusting on the inside of there, which I'm going to try and clean off. So obviously water was getting into this free wheel, which is a bit disappointing, but yeah, there we go. And I shall be getting myself a pack of about 50 1/8 ball bearings, and then we'll see if it's a little less sloppy. Because what I was finding was that when I actually had the wheel out of the back of the bike, and I got the cassette on it, it was actually, you know, if you had the wheel flat, the cassette would actually wobble on the Freehub left right by sort of 1.5 millimeters, sort of perpendicular to its actual axle. When I had the Freehub off, it didn't feel quite so bad. Now, some of it could be that the ball bearings in this outer race on the actual axle were again worn quite badly, and the cone on the actual axle was worn. But I think some of it is also to do with the bearings actually inside the Freehub itself. So, because there was still some movement when it was just the Freehub attached to the wheel and no axle through there. So, yeah, I'll tell you how to get them. I've taken the Freehub completely apart now. I've taken the paws off, and I've given them a good clean. There's the sort of retaining spring that keeps them, sort of spring loads them. I've also cleaned out this bit where, especially in there where the paws sort of rock and sit and pivot. That was a little bit rusty in there. That's a lot better. And I've cleaned the bottom seat around the bottom there, and I've also cleaned out the rust that was on the inside of the actual body itself. So about to put it back together now. I've got a new pack of 1.8 bearings that look a lot better condition than the ones I took out. Is nice and silvery still. They were, I think they were about £1.60 for a pack of 72, I think it was. So I've got some spares in there so I can drop a few on the floor and not be able to find them. And that was from Amazon. That was including postage, so these things are not very expensive, and it's sort of worth doing it if you want to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this back together and start greasing it up. Now I'm going to put some grease behind where the paws sit, not pack too much in so it sort of stops them pressing down, but certainly put it where they sort of pivot in this bit. So in here. And get this thoroughly greased up. Put a thin layer of grease over the whole sort of surfaces, because if you leave this sort of thing too long, even in sort of dampish air, it tends to get a bit of a flash coating of rust on it. And I'm going to do the same to coat the inside of this, and then we'll start to actually put the bearings back again. So I shall start putting it back together and grease it up, and back in a bit. That's all put back together and greased up. I'm just using a very generic lithium grease here. I think it's a TF2 one, which is good for bearings and things like that. It's quite nice because it's white. You can see where you've got it and everything, so it's quite good, decent bearing grease. As you can see here, I've got a nice thin layer over everything and behind the sort of paws. You need to make sure that when you sort of press these in, they will go in quite easily, and they don't sort of, because you've got too much grease behind, they sort of get stuck on the sort of stickiness of the grease. This one isn't too bad, so I think that's a good start. And I will now grease up the seat at the bottom so we can place that row of ball bearings back in it and put those 25 ones back. So what we're going to do is we can put a good thick layer of grease around that bottom race, and then add each of the balls to that. So that should allow them to stick there. Otherwise they'll be sort of bouncing around everywhere if you don't try and grease that this way. And then we can slip the body back over it. The 25 ball bearings seated back in, and the easiest way I found to do this was if you've got a small tipped screwdriver that's slightly magnetic. You don't think too magnetic, otherwise you'll magnetize the bearings. You can use that to pick them up, or actually if you've got a small paintbrush with a bit of the actual lithium grease stuck on it, then you can use that again to pick them up. So that's 25 seated in there. Note there is a slight gap in there. They're pretty much pressed together. You want to be careful not to put too many balls in. If you think, oh look, there's space for a 26th one in there, you must not put it in. Because these are loose bearings, they haven't got a sort of metal cage in which keeps them separated. You do need space between the balls when it freely runs. Otherwise, if you put too many in there, they'll actually press too close together, and you'll actually get bearings rubbing against bearings. So that's sort of now ready to have the actual body put on top of it. So I'm just going to grease up the inside of the actual body, and then we'll press that together. Done now is I've just put some lithium grease inside the body, give it sort of a thin smear around that sort of in the face. There's no real contact there. That should be sort of should be no contact there because of the bearings. But if you put a thin smear of grease in there, then hopefully any water, if it does get in, and it probably will, at least won't start corroding it. And I've packed a load of decent amount of grease around the pores. I mean, that shouldn't cause a problem. Well, we'll see when we put that together. And plenty on this sort of inner edge where the actual bearings will be sitting. I think they'll be sitting sort of just on that edge there. So I think the next job is now to carefully lower this on here. I may actually pause this because I can't really do this one-handed. Actually, no, let's swap the camera over. There we go. That seems to have gone down there. Okay. Right. So that seems to have seated in there. And yeah, go this way up. So you can see. There we go. You can just about see the. Come on, camera focus a bit. You can just about see the ball bearings shining in there. That's a bit better. It's a bit more in focus. So okay, right. Well, next job will be to grease up the bearing on the inside. The other bearing where the other 25 balls sit. So I'm going to count out another 25 of those and turn this over and pop those in as well. Now they'll be sitting. Turn this over that. Taking it apart again. They'll be sitting on the edge, which is just inside there. So again, we'll load them up, and the other side of that race is on the underside of that bit in there. So again, we can put some lubrication around there, some grease around there, and I'll put that back together. 25 balls are now seated inside that race. You can see that, and I have greased the underside of top race. And I've also put smear on the edge because again, even though it's not going to contact the edge of that if the ball racers are doing their job, it's just to keep the moisture off it. So we shall pop that in there and tighten it down. Remember, this is one which is it's not a clockwise tighten. This is an anti-clockwise. So when you put this back together, just remember to do that. And I'll need both hands for that. So to that point, I shall just pause this and be back with you in a bit. Oh, I forgot to mention actually. Don't forget to put the washers back in. So these went on top of the nut in there, or the thread in there. Now, if I remember rightly, the way these came off, the thickest was on first, and then the next thinnest, and then finally the very thinnest. Obviously they're sort of packed for size, so to actually just pack it out. So I'm going to put those back in. So that for me is the thickest. That's the next, and then that's the really thin one, just to give a little final bit of spacing. I'm just going to smear again just a little bit of grease on the faces of those actual washers, again just to keep any moisture off the actual metal surface. I shall pop those in. I'll be back in a moment. Okay, that's the last of the spacer washers greased up. So if we just drop that in there and just sort of some down. We can now put back to rice in there, and I'll get my my tool I made just to tighten this up. Okay, I think this will have to be two hands, so I'll just there we go, tighten up the fingers first. So we'll just tighten it up and see how that goes. Okay, that was a bit more problematic than I thought it would be. One thing I found is that you need to make sure when you're pushing or putting the washers in there, make sure you get them all the way down. Otherwise, they sort of tend to sit up on the actual ball bearings. I don't think it's because they're too big for the ball bearings. I think it's just a case of it, because they're quite a tight fit on the actual sort of central spindle here. I actually found I needed to make sure they were thoroughly pressed down, because if you put the seat in on top of them when they're not actually thoroughly pressed down, then you tend to the sort of the ball bearings tend to catch on it, and they sort of ride up on each other, and it won't screw down properly. This is now all screwed down properly, and it's all nicely freely moving and catching on the Freehub on the way back. So yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, the last couple of things we need to do before we finally finish is we need to put the dust seal back on the top. I'll press that in a moment, and also put the rubber seal back on the bottom. Now I've actually put this one back in, as you can see there. It's sealed in there quite nicely, and if we rotate it we can see it nicely smoothly going. So we'll put this the top dust seal back in, and then we're ready to load up with the quarter-inch bearings and to actually put the hub back together. The dust seal back in. Now I just used a fairly wide bladed screwdriver just to sort of put on that rim and tap on one side, then tap on the other side, and then sort of do it in the 4 opposite directions, just so you can gently seat it down, and keep doing that until basically it's sat on top of the seat below. So that's all back together now, and it seems to run quite nice and smoothly, and we'll have to see what it's like when it gets back on the bike. It's worth just showing you the axle that I took off from this. Goes to the Freehub body. Here's the axle itself, just a piece of rod, obviously. Now on the left hand side, on the Freehub body side, yeah, I think that's right. We have a lock nut that this gear clamps onto, the spacer washer, and then one of the cones, which is actually pressed inside a sort of soft rubbery dust seal and water seal. And on the other side, again, we have the lock nut, a washer, and on this side, instead of being a rubbery seal that the cone is surrounded by, it's actually a what feels like an aluminium housing, which the actual cone is pushed into. Now, I've partly pulled this out now, so you can actually see it, but it was pressed all the way back into there. Now, this definitely was a cone I wanted to replace because it is quite worn there. Now, to get this out of here, because it is a very tight interference fit, what I'd suggest you do is take your the actual axle, thread it on there a few turns, and then if you've got something you can sort of prop the actual outer bit up onto with a hole in the middle, and then just sort of tap it through. Now, when you tap it through, don't just tap on the end of the thread. If you're going to scrap one of the other cone nuts, put that on there so you don't damage the actual thread. Or if you've got a 10mm, 1mm pitch nut, put that on the end. But you just don't want to tap the end of the threads, because you might find that you'll knock them over, and then you won't be able to get the cones on. So I'm going to replace these 2 cones. Now, I bought myself some new ones. These are the ones, they're from the Wheels Manufacturers Inc. Now, I actually got these off eBay. These were a 10mm by 1mm pitch, and the part number was a CN-R081. Now, these look pretty nice. They fit perfectly actually on the axle, so they're the right pitch. I think you have to be a bit careful, because some of the pitches are imperial, and so they'll go on a few turns, and then they'll sort of jam and seize. But this one's definitely a 1mm pitch metric thread. Now, this is pretty close. If we take, do it one-handed, if we take the other cone off, Don't know how easy it's going to be to see if I do this. If I line the two cones up next to each other, find something white to do it against. It's a pretty reasonable match. I mean, in terms of the actual physical sizes, it's actually spot on with what it should be. The shape of the cone, which you might be able to see there, is very subtly different. The new one on the right has a very slightly steeper tailing off cone than the original on the left. Have I got that right? No, sorry, the original is on the right, sorry, and the new one is on the left. So actually the cone is very slightly, doesn't taper off quite so much on the new one. I don't think that should be a problem. I've made a rough try of it in the actual, on the axle in the actual seat itself. Like I say, it shouldn't make much of a difference. There's only actually very minor contact on the cone anyway, because you actually put a 1/4 inch ball bearing against this. It doesn't touch the whole of that sort of a shape side, the actual curve there. It's actually only really touching on a very small surface area. So this is going to touch on a very slightly different position, but not by much, I don't think. So it may mean that the nut is done up slightly tighter or slightly further into the hub than the old cone nut, but like I say, I don't think that should be a problem. Now, one thing I did find with this is the new one is, although it measures with a micrometer as being exactly the same as the old one to within 1/100th of a millimeter, it is very slightly tight in this aluminium housing. Now, what I would suggest you do if you find this either with any replacements you actually do, what I suggest you do is you actually chill. You use actual temperature expansion to actually help you out here. So warm the outer piece up, either with a hairdryer, or if you've got a electric paint stripper that gets it a bit hotter, you can pop that in it. I wouldn't get too hot because you might damage the anodizing and you might actually warp the metal, but if you get it to a reasonable temperature, and then you can actually put the cone in, say, a bag in the freezer. So the cone should then shrink a little bit, and the outer piece will expand very slightly. And if you put the two together fairly quickly, press them in, and again you can use the axle, wind into the threads just a few times with, again, perhaps the old cone nut on the end. You can then tap it down and that should get it in there okay. So I think it's now time to start putting this all back together. This bit's probably going to be quite difficult to actually show you in sort of stages because I need both hands for it. But yeah, that's how it is at the moment. The Freehub mounted back on the wheel again, and we actually can start putting the bearings back together. So we turn over. I've already started to put some grease inside the hub bit on this side, the actual seat on this side. So we'll put plenty of grease in there. And just like we did with the Freehub body, if you put plenty of grease in there, you can then place the ball bearings in there. So I've got 9 ball bearings to go back in this side. And then we'll put the axle through. Perhaps put a slight bit of grease around this rubber seal. So this is actually a rubber seal on that one, that black one. And put the axle through, and then we can start putting the ball bearings back in on the Freehub side. So I shall carry on putting a little bit more grease in there because I can see a little bit that we haven't quite got. And yeah, see how it goes. Here we got plenty of grease in there, and that's holding the balls in quite nicely. So really the next job is just to carefully push the axle through. So there I've screwed up the axle again. So I've got I managed to get the cone, the new cone nut into the metal dust seal cap, and I've tightened the lock nut down on that with the actual spacer washer. It was actually quite tight, that was. I had to warm it up quite a bit to actually get it in there, and just give it a fairly reasonable tap with the hammer just to get it nicely in. Be careful not to obviously tap against the actual cone bit itself at the bottom there. Always do it on the thread or on something else, otherwise you could damage the bottom of the cone there because obviously it's being a bit thinner. So yes, all we're good now is put that in there. Actually, just a quick thing. Remember to put the balls in the ball bearings in on the Freehub side as well before we put the axle through, because obviously there won't be enough room between the actual axle and the dust seal to get the ball bearings in. So again, I've packed that out with some grease, some lithium grease again. Use that to sort of stick the balls in there, and then we'll just need to push the axle through from the other side, and then we can start sort of putting the cone nut on this side and tightening it up appropriately so it moves freely, but there's a little bit of it's quite tight. So okay, there's the axle through. So now it's just a case of putting the other cone nut on there, the spacer, and the rubber seal, which effectively seals that sort of cone-shaped rubber seal will seal just on the top edge of that dust seal. So that's how that one seals on this side, and that hopefully will keep some of the moisture out again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a decent amount of grease around this, which obviously you can see I've done already, but also around that seal, just to try and if all possible, give a bit of more of a barrier than it was previously to keep the water out. So hopefully I won't be having to do this again in the near future. Okay, I've got the rubber seal back on the cone nut now. I haven't actually tuned the cone nut, tightened it up yet, and I haven't actually got the locking nut on there yet. I put plenty of grease behind the actual rubber seal there and pressed it down into the groove in the actual dust seal. So hopefully that's going to produce a nice seal. With all that grease in there, hopefully we won't get any more water coming in. So as we can see, there's just enough space now to get a pair of cone spanners on there, so we can actually tune this up. That'll be my next task, which I must admit will be new to me to tune these actual up. So it runs freely, but it's fairly tight on the actual bearings. So yeah, looking good so far. So let's get the locking nuts on and get this axle so it rotates freely, and but it's nice and tight. Okay, here it's all fitted back on the axle again now. So I've adjusted the cone nuts. Now what I did was I followed a guide on the Silverline website. Now what they say on that is that when you tighten these up, you don't want to tighten it too tight, especially with hollow axles with skewers. Going by the feel alone, they say is not particularly accurate, because the actual grinding on the actual the cones varies depending on cone to cone. So some can be quite smooth, some can be naturally a little bit rough because of the grinding marks. So that's perfectly reasonable. And so just going on the feel alone is not necessarily an ideal sort of indicator. Now, one thing they were saying that you should have a little bit of play in the actual bearings when the wheel is out of the actual frame itself, because when you tighten the skewer up, you effectively squash. You put a little bit of compression actually on the actual cones and the nuts, which will actually tighten it up a bit. And their suggestion is that you adjust it. You give it a bit of a wobble on the axle itself, out of the frame, and I can just about feel a little bit of movement, maybe a little bit of clicking you can hear. Though obviously if you've greased up the bearings quite a lot, you may or may not hear that particularly well. So I've adjusted that, tightened up the cone and the lock nuts, popped it up in the frame, and sort of given the wheel a little bit of a pull left and right on the actual frame to see if there's any movement there. Now the first time I did this, there was still a fair bit of movement on the actual axle in the frame, even after it had been tightened up on the skewers. So I took it out, did a bit less than a quarter of a turn, put it back in again. That felt nice and tight in the frame, and I also think I can feel a little bit of movement sort of out of the frame. So it's not too tight. Like I say, you don't want it too tight because you'll actually put too much pressure on the bearings. They should be snug, but not overly tight. You don't want to squash it, make it difficult for that thing to rotate. Now, because these are new cones in here, and I've got a few other things that are fairly new, and sort of all things seating. I'm actually going to take this wheel out again in maybe months cycling, and just feel what the bearings are like again, and just do any minor adjustments again at that point. But yeah, I think that's probably okay now, and I think it's time to remount the cassette, which I probably won't bother showing actually because it's fairly standard. And my bike is back and good to go again. I mean, this is all looking really quite nice now. Feels nice. The Freehub locks nicely, and when you spin it on the axle, it all feels quite nice. So yeah, I think for the cost of a couple of sets of ball bearings and a little bit of time, a little bit of effort, and a set of cone spanners which I didn't have anyway, which was always prove useful. Yeah, you can revitalise an old Freehub without having to buy a new one. There we go. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Hope it's useful to somebody anyway. Apologies for the slightly wobbly camera work and the cutting at all various times, but yeah, I haven't got an ideal setup here for actually doing this, but thought it was worth just sharing it with people just in case they want to see how to do it with this particular hub. Okay, just one last quick addition. It's all back together now. It's all spinning nicely. I did find that when I first put it back together, I was getting a little bit of binding on the brakes because I've got disc brakes on this bike. The actual whole axle was very slightly too close to the piston side. I suspect that's probably just a slight difference in the length, only a very subtle difference in the length of the new cone I pressed into the metal dust seat or dust seal. So I've actually taken the spacer washer out that was just in there. It's only quite a thin one, and that seems to have just moved it across enough that the disc brakes are no longer binding, and it sort of rotates smoothly. I'm going to check this again in a few hundred miles, just in case the cone has seated a bit more fully inside that aluminium dust seal. I mean, I when I put it in there, like I say, I warmed it up and I sort of hammered it in using the actual axle thread until it didn't seem to move any further. I'll even try to sort of push a piece of paper in at the end to see what the gap was. It's quite difficult being obviously you're pressing inside something, so it's actually quite difficult to see how far it's seated in. That could just be the only reason, and like I say, a very, very slight difference in the actual length of the actual cone nut itself. But then again, that's what those sort of spacer washers are there for, just to provide you with that little bit of sort of adjustment anyway. And so it's all back together on this side as well. Yeah, all back to normal. So brilliant. I shall now enjoy riding my bike again.